an expert, the economist and Russian investment banker, who's head of Diamond Age Capital Advisors, will talk to us. Also, and please, when you'll be asking the speaker questions, please ask in Russian. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to express a very warm gratitude to the organizers of the investment conference to which I arrived in Kiev, and also to your media center and every Ukrainian for a very warm welcome that was extended to myself and a great number of international investors who came to Kiev these days. The topic of my speech here is the impact of sanctions on Russian economy, and I'd like to offer you a short trip into the history of these sanctions, and then having this as a basis to tell you how I see the impact of these sanctions on the economy. In 1979, the so-called fourth bloc of the Politburo, the CPSU, including the ideological leaders like Suslov, have decided to send Soviet forces into Afghanistan. Then there was more than 10 years of bloody war, tens of thousands of losses, a huge number of people who were maimed and wounded, and sanctions from many countries, including the USA, which led in particular to the almost full boycott of the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980. These days, right after the Olympics in Sochi, in the last hours of the month of February, there was a brainstorm in Kremlin, including a think tank, if we can call them so, of the Council of Security of the Russian Federation. If you go to the Council of Security site, you'll see the entire composition. The head is President Putin. Then there's the head of Federal Security Service, Bortnikov, head of the administration of the President Ivanov, the Minister of Defense, and also heads of both chambers of the Russian Federal Parliament. As far as I understand, and I don't have contacts among these people, as far as I understand, the decision to send troops to Ukraine was adopted by this Security Council in the last days or maybe even last hours of February. And in order to provide the so-called constitutional legitimacy to this decision, they had to vote in the upper chamber of the Russian parliament, the Council of Federation, that was convened for extraordinary session in a very strange way on Saturday, a day off. And the agenda was voting for the resolution that had to allow the president to introduce troops into Ukraine. This is a public information of the general access. It's just that not everybody understands this to the full. And this means that all the decisions that were taken by the Council of Security were absolutely non-public. The Russian public had no idea about this. And every Russian citizen, excluding members of the Council of Security and senators, members of the Council of Federation, got to know about what happened from the news. More than that, among my environment, professional investors and bankers who understand that most probably the Russian financial and economic bloc of the government have not known anything about this until the last minute. And we remember very well where we were when we got to know that there is such a resolution of the Council of Federation. This was late, this was the evening of the 1st of March. I was at the concert led by Mr. Bashmet, and I just read this on my iPhone in the interval between the first and second parts of the concert. I immediately understood what's going to happen. Then the public financial markets reacted on the first morning of after this voting on Monday, when the financial market fell by 12%, and Russia has not experienced such a low falling for many, many years. The Russian ruble has not fallen to the same extent, which was rather surprising. And later, we understood why the fall of the ruble was not so strong. It turned out that the central bank has just burned $12 billion of their hard currency reserves in order to support the ruble during one day. This is public information that you can get from the site of the central bank. And then everybody knows what was happening. Russia received a portfolio, if I can say so, of problems, including sanctions. When the sanctions were introduced, or rather when there was just a danger of sanctions, the majority of people, including both in Russia and outside of Russia, have not known the precise effect that they would produce. They started to take different books from dusty shelves by people who were researching the action of sanctions on different countries like Iran, Northern Korea, Sudan, and so on. In those analytical researches, they said, and also some historical evidence proved, that in many countries the regime does not fall because of sanctions, and the regime would introduce the so-called mobilization economy, which of course is detrimental to the well-being of the people. But if the regime is not overthrown from outside, it is very seldom that the regime self-destructs. So the argument about Russia was about this. But the matter is that Russia is very different from Sudan, Northern Korea, or Sudan. First of all, there's a scale of Russian economy. Although the scale of the economy is 10 or 8 times less than the US, but of course this is not Northern Korea or Iran. But I think that the major factor, and I think there are two major factors, first of all them is that whoever how treats and sees Mr. Putin and his environment, you have to recognize that Russia was moving along the way of the full financial and economic integration into the global world. for the last 20 hours. And the last 14 or 15 years were under the direct or indirect leadership of Mr. Putin. Russia was always going along the path of integration. And this is not a exception for 2013 and even for the first months, 2 months of 2014. So, taking into account the level of globalization that was achieved by the modern world now, there was a V-turn that actually is a V-turn 180 degrees, a rather big world economy that produces almost $2 trillion of GDP a year in goods and services, was moving with a certain acceleration or deceleration in one direction, and suddenly there's a stop, a V-turn, and the course at the de-integration with the rest of the world. No one has staged such an experiment in the history of civilization, because the level of globalization in the modern world or the size of economies, not the degree of such a turn, was not shown by no one. So there's no empirical data, no scientific data to conduct any research about what's going to happen. We can only try to suggest what's happening. And another factor among those two major factors is the lack of the understanding of the effect of sanctions in the present-day world of economy and global finance. The matter is that even the economists whom I very much respect, Sergei Alexashenko, for instance, who is the example for me as far as the understanding of the depth of the situation is concerned, and who is, I think, an example of the developed cosmopolitanism. He has lived for a number of years in Washington, D.C. He does understand how the financial world lives, but he does not give its full value to what whom I call economist botanists don't understand. But this is a good term. I mean such people as Andrei Larionov, Sergei Alexashenko, Sergei Kubriev, and many others, but they have never been for many years in trading halls of investment banks or in trading departments of investment funds, and they do not understand fully how in reality the capital moves in the modern world, while it moves not only sidestepping sanctions, it does sidestep those places which may be next to the sanctions. The financial world is built around the relations between financial institutions, and these relations cannot be established without trust between people and different institutions. And this is a foundation for the trade in the financial world, the entire international trade. And it's been regulated, this process of trust and opening trade lines is being regulated by departments of compliance. These departments allow or not allow to trade with another institution on the basis of due diligence, the checking of everything, the entire information on another financial institution, and when in difference of the so-called web banks or the banks with a majority state participation like OTB, we're talking about full private organizations like Merrill Lynch, BNP Paribas, Namur, or from every part of the world. So there, the compliance officers, the bankers who are responsible for allowing or banning banks from having relations with someone, they get bonuses from their organizations. They work for shareholders of these organizations. And if there's an expectation while concluding a contract to get profit, part of this profit will not go to this compliance officer as a percentage to. They will just have a bonus, a usual bonus. But if as a result of such contract or agreement there's a flop not based on the investment mistake, and you cannot avoid them, but if this is based on the bad work of the compliance department, if you have concluded some agreement or contract and another side refuse to conclude or to go on, then this compliance officer will be fired. They will lose their job. And in many cases, this will easily end in unusual trip to downtown Manhattan to see the prosecutor.
That is about what we call violation of sanctions. And in the last 2 years, there were many visits to prosecutors in many international banks, and in most cases, the international banks agreed to pay to the U.S. government and U.S. Ministry of Finance the amount of $12 billion, the total amount, with the record fine issued to BNP Paribas in many billion dollars, and that is the amount which is higher than any possible or impossible profit that could have been earned. Now, what's happening with the bank which violates the sanctions? For example, HSBC or Citigroup. I'm talking about that theoretically. They are trying to circumvent sanctions and transfer some amount to Northern Korea. They will not do that, but they may have relations with the Chinese bank in Macau, and they illegally have these relations with the Chinese bank in Macau, and via Macau the money go to Pyongyang. The first objective of American government is bank in Macau, and the second one is those who were involved into that from the Western world, and this bank in Macau stops functioning within 24 hours. Why? If it participated in such a transaction, then it will be taken out of the world financial system, because no one will have any relations with the bank in Macau. It will become taboo for the whole banking business. So the countries, and it's in Russia, not only in Russia, they think that Chinese will help us. That is nonsense, because Chinese will never be getting into antagonistic relations with the U.S. on the one hand. On the other hand, they understand what violation of sanctions mean. And if you look at the list of the countries and governments which antagonists of the U.S., you will not see good countries there. You will not see China there. And that is why the sanctions make Russia as an investment target absolutely toxic. And when I, for the first time, pronounced that word, some civil servants in Russia said that Rabinovich is again talking nonsense. Toxicity is nonsense. We have a great environmental situation in Chernobyl. They have toxicity, but basically the word toxicity is a standard jargon in financial industry all over the world. And if anyone in the chain of in the financial chain becomes toxic, such toxic link falls out from this chain. And Russia has become toxic not because of specific sanctions against certain organizations, against certain physical entities, but it has become toxic because it's better not to deal with Russia than to deal with Russia. It's not from my point of view, it's from point of view of a hypothetical compliant officer of HSBC Bank. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to visit the prosecutor. They don't want to bring to the bank their 5 or 10 billion fine, and it's easier to prohibit than allow business with Russia. And if you ask any banker in Russia now, and then the relations are very much complicated in financial institutions and banks. The payments do not go well. The new accounts are not open. The correspondent accounts are being closed, and that has very big consequences on other sectors of Russian economy, because financial industry in English is called financial services industry, and that is the tissue of the economy. International trade is impossible without that. International trade starts suffering, both export and import. The financial attack on ruble starts. The golden reserves go down. And I can tell you about what will be happening, as I think so, depending on how many minutes more I have. If I don't have time for that, then maybe when you ask me questions, I will be able to tell you more about that chain. But we would like to hear about the time factor. You cannot focus the whole situation, but taking into account the situation that Russia has enough currency reserves, let's talk about time. How quickly can we expect effect from such sanctions? You are asking the question which is not worth 1 million or 1 billion, but it's worth 1 trillion. Timing is impossible to forecast, especially because we do not know what mistakes could be committed by the President Putin and by subordinate to him and to Prime Minister, so-called financial economic bloc of the government. There are three major mistakes which they may commit, which will lead to the collapse much faster than the slow agony. The three mistakes which could be committed: to continue burn golden reserve and the National Welfare Fund to protect ruble. The objective, financial objective, will not be achieved because ruble eventually, and it may stop being foreign exchange currency, but sooner or later the ruble will be there, and all money spent from the golden reserve will be burned. Basically, then, this is important issue because many people believe that Russia has a big safety pillow, but that is absolute, how to put it, soft. Well, you understand what I mean. Russia has accumulated huge amounts, $500 billion in the total. And in good years, everyone presented Russia as the third biggest creditor in the world with high golden reserves. There are big reserves in Japan and China, and Russia was the third one. But Russia has a big trade turnover, export and import. The Central Bank of Russia has to keep a minimum golden reserve, a minimum amount, which is about $150 to $200 billion in reserves to ensure 6 months of import. And that's money which cannot be spent on any circumstances. And there are few hundreds billion which are split between the National Welfare Fund and Golden Reserve, and this money is spent to maintain ruble, to support ruble, and 12 billion was spent on the 3rd of March. And we just need 10 days like that to spend $120 billion. And if it's done so that the money is spent to support ruble, then Russia will have no at all pillow of safety. Secondly, the National Welfare Fund, that there's a big line of people to National Welfare Fund, and these are people who believe they need to be supported, especially the organizations which fell under sanctions, or maybe some hired managers of state-owned companies who know that it's either now or never, that it may collapse, and they have to get as much money as they can, because when it gets collapsed, then it will be too late to get anything. And this line of people is just growing, and the appetite of these people are of cosmic amount. First, one talks about some huge amount, then they mention 3.5 trillion rubles. Rosneft mentioned 3.5 trillion rubles, and in their case, the oil production is going down, so there's no big safety pillow, and that's a first mistake that Putin and financial economic bloc can commit. They can burn all that. The second mistake that can lead to fast crash or collapse is some restoration in this or that form of what was called the Gosplan, state plan in Soviet times, and introduce state regulation of prices. This will lead to shortage of goods, to lines in the stores, and to immediate black market, because all white capitalist mechanisms will be broken, and this will be time for gray and black mechanisms of capitalism, which from the point of view of the black market will be, well, this will be basically violation of laws, and this will cause some consequences which are difficult to forecast, but they will be strong, and they will very quickly lead to social tension, which may later turn into social outburst. And third danger.
Вот этого списка, который не имеет.
And the third danger from this list that does not have a direct relation to finance and economy is the call for support of the so-called mobilizing economy, the Black Hundred, to call for the support of Black Hundred. I use this word, Black Hundred. I don't mean that what this word does mean in historic connotation, but anything that is going up to the surface now, and this going to the surface of a mess of is very dangerous, because this process is easy to start, and it's started already, but it's we don't know how to end this. And during any economic collapse, we do not know who can come to power, and this is a rather dangerous situation. I think that in the final result, this will be very unpleasant to the Kremlin itself. One thing is to do what they do, and another thing is to have real Black Hundred or some similar types in numerous who would hardly want to see the present Russian leadership. And this dangerous situation can result in anything, including the civil war, God forbid, and some separation of some regions. I am afraid of what Putin is afraid at the same moment, although we are on different positions, but we are afraid of the same thing, of the detriment to the territorial integrity of Russia, and God forbid the civil war in such a country that is stuffed with nuclear weapons of unknown quality. This is dangerous, first of all, to Russia. In the second turn, it's dangerous to Ukraine and the entire world. Thank you very much. I understand that you can talk with no end on this topic, as you have the enormous experience of investment banker, and we have questions from the audience. Can you tell us, please, the issues that you have described? I am far from the idea that, well, you know, there's a number of advisors who do not understand this danger, but who is now putting these or those decisions into the ears of Russian leadership? why don't they heed the word of reason? Well, thank you for the question. This is a question worth $1 trillion. I have contacts in the Russian economic and financial bloc, and maybe I do not understand the situation 100%, but here's still my understanding. When they adopted in the end of February, in the beginning of March, the decisions, not a single person from the Security Council, from the entire list of people who worked in the KGB in their times, they did not imagine that there will be sanctions. But you know, in 2008 happened what happened to Georgia, and they went unpunished, and they really thought that everything will be the same this time, although on a larger scale. So among those people, there was no understanding or even a thought about sanctions, not to mention the toxic character. However, the financial and the economic people understood this, everything, but at the moment when they report, as they love to say, to the president, there is an impression that he does understand everything adequately, and he agrees to some argument and even sends his personal friend Alexei Kudrin to Western capitals in order to help. But Kudrin is not a magician. He understands why the sanctions are there and why they will not be removed. And he understands why the toxic character will stay there for years. So if Kudrin comes and says to President Putin, I think so, the President Putin will agree with him, but the next morning Kudrin will read from the news that everything is done in a completely different way. So it happens that Putin as if agrees to a good advice, but then everything happens the other way around. As an uninformed person, I understand that there are situations between Siluanov, Lubimlin, Lukayev, and Kudrin, who is not a member of the government, but who does have a contact, and President Putin. And what happens after this, no one knows. Me or investment community in the world or those people, we do not know what are the mechanisms of decision making and who takes part together with the President Putin in this decision making. And they do not take into account that everything is gonna become even worse as far as investment economy is concerned. But maybe they are also pursuing other goals. We still have another question. Can you tell us what sanctions do you expect in the future, if they are there? What are the most probable sanctions? Then there was an information that they were planning to exclude Russia from the SWIFT system. How real is this? All that you said is realistic, but if there's a scenario of worsening the conflict with the Ukraine, if Russia sends its troops not in the way that it is happening now, like undeclared war. If they, for instance, went to Kiev, as President Putin said that if he wants, then this may happen very fast, then Russia will immediately face new sanctions. The export of oil and gas will be banned. I'm sure there will be a huge economic crisis in the world, because this will be a huge shock on the oil and gas market, but the civilized world won't allow Russia to realize this scenario, even at the price of a huge financial crisis. However, SWIFT does fall into the same potential category, and I am sure that Russia has stopped where they stopped because of the initial shock of unexpected sanctions that no one was thinking about at the beginning, and the ban on SWIFT and other sanctions. They understand that the sky will fall down to earth. So from the point of view of this slow developing schizophrenia, I don't think that the sanctions will be reinforced, but I don't think they will be weakened. So I asked everyone, you and your viewers and readers, to remember the fact that up to 75 or 90% of the reasons that the sanctions were introduced, not the existence of the so-called DNR or LNR, or the financing of terrorist groups, as they say in the West, and that they call in a completely different way of in Russia. But in reality, this is the joining of Crimea to the Russian Federation, but not a single country in the world accepted this. And in the entire outer world, they say that this is illegal annexation of Crimea. So on the basis of illegal annexation of Crimea, the great majority of sanctions and their degree and their force cannot be repelled until Crimea is in the status that in the West, and not only in the West, is being considered an illegal annexation. I am very much surprised at the fact that the Russian government, as far as I understand, do not have any roadmap to solve the situation with Crimea. So from the point of view of the Russian government, the Russian parliament, the Council of Federation, the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation, and the great number of people, Crimea has declared independence. It was accepted into Russian Federation, and all the constitutional events were held and measures. But this was done, first of all, with the violation of the Russian constitution. Of course, I am not a lawyer and not a head of the constitutional head, Zorkin, who has to decide whether this is violation or not. But from my very plebic point of view, as far as my law knowledge is concerned, the constitution of the Russian Federation was directly violated. I do not impose my opinion. I am just voicing this as a private opinion. You know, in the Constitution, we have the clause that international acts, treaties, and laws prevail over the Russian Constitution and over different laws if there are different understanding. So in this situation, the memorandum on the territorial integrity of Ukraine of the 1995, if I'm not mistaken, this so-called Budapest memorandum, and the Treaty of Peace and Cooperation were just thrown out of the window in violation of the Russian constitution, because it stipulates that they cannot be thrown away. Of course, at the same moment, the constitution of Ukraine was violated, because Crimea cannot proclaim its independence by way of referendum under the muzzles of submachine guns. And according to the Ukrainian constitution, there has to be an all-Ukrainian referendum. So we now see some unsurmountable facts as far as the situation with Crimea is concerned. They lead to the fact that there's no roadmap at the disposal of the Russian government, and it cannot exist. And until this issue is absolutely open, what's going to happen if there's such a situation, then I think this machine of sanctions will rotate without any stop. Well, Russia does not have a map, and they are not going to surrender Crimea. Let's look at another side, the U.S. and European countries. For how long they can allow themselves to preserve the status quo, taking into account that this does influence their economies as well. I think that the set of sanctions that's been introduced was introduced by people who are clever. You know, they've made a brainstorm as far as the set of sanctions are concerned that would not, for instance, barbarously decrease the well-being of the Russian population, because the Russian official propaganda is now tuning the Russian people against U.S. and Europeans, which is the violation of the laws of Russian Federation, because the laws say and the constitution says that propaganda is banned in the mass media. So they understood that they should not impact the population, because the sanctions now anyway do hit the population very hard, but they were very much targeted against certain companies and certain persons, individuals. For instance, you can read on the site of the Ministry of the U.S. Treasury, you can read in English word letters the so-called Ozero Cooperated. This is unprecedented situation when on the OFAC and the Treasury of the United States, there are all the documents. You can see them in PDF, and you'll see two categories: the closest environment of Putin and cooperative Ozero. This is an unprecedented situation when the U.S. government speaks about the so-called Ozero Cooperative, which is situated in 100 kilometers to the north of St. Petersburg on the bank of Komsomolsky Lake. And of course, this does impact the economic growth in Europe, but not materially, and it does not almost impact the growth of GDP in the US. Coming back to Russia, in spite of the sanctions are against certain companies and individuals, but the after effects are felt by the entire population. So how the Russian population understand what's happening? Recently I met an information that in some key mass media the large-scale fall of ruble was presented as a huge success, like for instance when the dollar has reinforced its position to 42 rubles.
Unfortunately, during the last 15 years, I cannot tell that that's really a targeted policy against the leadership of the country. It would be probably unfair to say that and cruel, but there was declared or undeclared war against population, making them stupid because of the total collapse of the whole system of education and because of the brainwashing. And it wasn't done during the last months of the propaganda, which is prohibited by the constitution, by also by all those soap operas that do not add to the intellect, but just do the opposite. And now we can say that a big percentage of population doesn't have any ability to analyze what is the reason and the result of the cause and effect. A few people in Russia can think logically. The collapse of ruble that's taking place and that the government is trying to prevent. On the one hand, this would be a mistake to burn all golden reserves, but on the other hand, that is what what Kasparov called Zugzwang, and that's determined the chess, where you are in the position when your any move will make your position even worse. And burning the golden reserve and support of ruble is one bad move, and non-burning the golden reserve and non-supporting ruble is another bad move, because the ruble gets devalued even faster, and with that, just a nightmare takes place. And the first thing is bankruptcy of importers. When importers go bankrupt, then they cause another wave. All companies which operate together in economic process, they also go bankrupt. And these are transportation, logistical companies, warehouses, the trading chains. And then we see how jobs are lost. And that means that with the deterioration of the economy, when people cannot find other jobs, many families are deprived of the sources of income. And plus to the valuation of ruble, especially if their income is in rubles, that means that their purchase capacity goes down both in the world and inside Russia from the point of view of imported goods. Besides, based on that, they are getting poorer, and those families or households which are poorer but which have many debts, they go bankrupt. And we are talking about crediting, about automobile car crediting, and mortgage crediting, especially if it were in hard currency. When the households go bankrupt, the banks take their assets, but the banks are not in the business of getting old cars and old household equipment. They're in a different business, and they don't need these assets. These are bad assets, and the percentage of non-paid assets starts. And I was taught in New York in a school of business that the bank will collapse if his assets do not correspond to liabilities, and this could be the assets evaluation, the duration, and the liquidity of the assets. Of these things do not coincide. If the entity goes bankrupt, okay, the Sberbank takes it and just imagine, well, they take the shares of that company, but you go to Sberbank to get your money, to withdraw money from the deposit, and they will what? Give you this deposit in shares of that company. So basically, there might be the plan to save this Russian banking system. There's no money for that, but at the same time, Russian private and state-owned companies have aggregated debt, and that's $1 trillion, out of which 150 billion is to be paid next 12, 18 months. So there's no money, state money for all that debt. And we can compare it with the US of 2008, and we can understand what the scale of disaster is, because in the US, the mechanisms of capitalism were violated in 2007 when the US had to nationalize Fannie Mae and Fannie Mae, two big mortgage companies, NAG, one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, and nationalized, many few people know about that, nationalized the biggest bank of the U.S., Citigroup. After that, it was privatized back, and the U.S., the state even earned money on that, and U.S. taxpayers did not lose but earned money on that. But nationalization at that time was needed. And nationalization of such organization as Citigroup. But in the U.S., $17 trillion economy, and that's annual. And also, the USA is the center for issuing the world currency. You can print it out, and it was done based on the Paulson plan. You can Google Plan Paulson, and you will see what was happening then. And there was a lot of criticism from Republican Party because that was the violation of the principles of capitalism, but nevertheless the plan worked. But the plan also prevented the fall of the world economy, of the whole global economy. It did not allow the Great Depression to take place. There was a big recession, but the global depression was prevented. Russia cannot do that, because if they print out rubles like the U.S. printed out dollars and they nationalized Citibank, it's impossible to nationalize the Sberbank, even printing out the rubles, because these rubles will be needed for Rosneft and for another $170 billion of corporate debts, which they have. So I don't know. All this situation could be resolved, but not starting from financial economic measures, which do not exist. Basically, we need to start from political and geopolitical measures. Then my last question. You are investment bank economist. If Putin would come to you as a client, what would you recommend him to resolve the situation? I would have resolved it within several months if the President Putin would have given me the mandate, but I would have started from geopolitics. Secondly, I would take a plane, would go to New York, and would bring to Moscow Hank Paulson, Bob Rubin, Bill Clinton, Larry Fink, who's the founder of the biggest private equity fund, and Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, and I would put them into one room, and I would say, we will resolve all this situation in geopolitics with Ukraine in presence of the US and European Union. We will sign an agreement for the eternity, and we will never violate this agreement with Ukraine. if politically it is impossible to return Crimea today based on the internal situation in Russia. I'm not talking about my position. My position is different. But practically, if it is impossible to now give the Crimea back based on what's happening in Russia, then in this case, they will have to get an international conference on Crimea and ask what should be done. When all the sides agree, Ukraine, US, European Union, other countries, and Russia, on what to do with Crimea, maybe do pre-China Hong Kong of it. And when this is all signed, and Ukraine and Russia are again friends, they are again big trade partners, then in this case, the people who I named and who I would have brought from New York, I would have requested them to work together with us to do the financial sphere in Russia similar to what's working in the world, not to create anything new in Russia, because it's all working in the world. Better or worse, but still, we understand that the U.S. have the most efficient, the most powerful financial system, economic system, which works and operates in reality. They have some problems, just according to textbooks, once in a cycle, but they are trying to tune them up so that they are not fatal, the mistakes. But that's the most flexible system that can exist in the world, with finances, with economy. But they say that Russia has some way of its own, but that's nonsense when people are talking about that. You know perfectly well all these people who publicly talk about that, and I believe that they are pseudo academicians, and this will not lead to any good results. Thank you for such an interesting conversation. We have delayed it in time. We're sorry for taking all your time, but we got a lot of very useful information. Thank you, and our next press briefing will be in 5 minutes. Thank you.